other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by Robotoyz. More information in a moment.
Often, when a new installment in anything releases, the previous entries form a context that shapes the views of the current entry. I adore Xenoblade 1. Always have. Favorite game of all time. Upon first playing Xenoblade 2, I was a little underwhelmed. Now I've gone back and played X, and I respect a lot more of what it did as a result. Or take the Transformers films, for instance. The Bumblebee movie on its own is just a solid film, but in the context of the other films, fans consider it a masterpiece. This sort of thing actually happened with Magic Square's lineup. Time and time again, they had put out subpar legend scale figures. And by the time Ragnar rolled around, it seemed like there was no end in sight. This is one of the reasons Breakdown and Wild Rider were so well received. In comparison to all of that shit, it was less a breath of fresh air and more an air cannon filled with aphrodisiac. Thing is, the next set didn't really have that benefit. There were a few months between the releases of set 1 and set 2, and by that time, the hype was a bit different. It hadn't quite died down, but it definitely wasn't at the same levels as before. As such, there was kind of a lot more riding on Dragstrip and Dead End. They had to show the first two weren't just a fluke. And more importantly, they had to up the game in the engineering department. All eyes were locked on Magic Square. Could they deliver? Greetings, Cybertronians. I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis continues this 4-part series. Welcome to Menasor Month. For the second installment, we examine the second set released in Magic Square's Menasor lineup. MS-B12, Pillage, and MS-B13 contain. Once again, I have no clue which is which, so I'm calling them Dragstrip and Dead End like a normal person. Honestly, nobody outside of obsessive Fanstoys fans insist you call figures by their third-party names. Although, to be fair, Magic Square fans have been showing similar fanaticism as of late. Oh well, I've never been one to give a shit. Let's hit it! Regardless of which scale you design for, Legbots are typically the easier figures to block out. They normally don't have to add any extra engineering under the hood, aside from a few rare cases. As long as they're the right height in vehicle mode, you can get away with a lot more. Conversely, Armbots have to shove in a whole extra elbow up their cloacas. Doing the whole split section can alleviate this, but typically that's how ARM Combiner engineering goes. This makes Legacy Mini kinda funny considering it's essentially the opposite situation, but you know what they say, exceptions make the rules. And although these two have the split gimmick, they also allow the normal system to work, so the rule most certainly applies to them. You wouldn't think it from a cursory glance though, because these two are pretty sexy. One thing that really surprised me is how well both of the alternate modes are captured. Despite the extra engineering put in, these two are much closer to the real vehicles than the leg counterparts. Take Dragstrip for instance. Putting him next to the Tyrell P34 shows a striking resemblance. The only real deviation is the size of the engine section to account for the ankle supports, but aside from that, it's pretty much on point. And hot damn, what a sexy alt mode it is. It's a long, flattened, downward sloped slab of racing glory, and it looks mighty fine in these colors. The paint detail on the front is absolutely insane, with 3 separate colors used in order to provide visual interest. Love the golden brown they chose here. It's very similar to the one the Legacy version uses, and both are a dead ringer for the Sunbow model. Now, as a quick heads up, if you're planning on getting the upscaled version, you sadly lose this. They swapped it out for this awful diarrhea shade. No idea why they made this change, I'm guessing it was probably cheaper to use. Either way, the OG has it better. Only thing I can really complain about here is the red. It probably could have used another coat because there's a bit of bleed happening from underneath. This is why I usually praise red when it's done well. What we're seeing here is the norm, and what I've usually pointed out is the exception. Still, that aside, they've done a bang-up job here. Also, dig how clean the seating area is. Might seem like a no-brainer, but don't forget Hasbro decided to plonk the whole ass head in here. Yes, I know it's meant to represent a seat, but it doesn't do it very well. And taking it further back, hot damn, that's one sexy engine block. As mentioned earlier, it is a heavy departure from the original to account for the robot mode stability. It doesn't just increase in size too, it also becomes much flatter. Personally though, I kinda like it. I like how pronounced it is, and how the paint picks out the extra details. It kinda gives this a cartoony aesthetic, and not in the sense of the Sunbow model. It makes the design look like an 80s animator did a Sakuga-filled racing scene, before the 2000s hit and all the cars turned into CG. Now I've seen complaints about the solidity of this section, and they are kind of valid. A lot of people have trouble getting this to lock into place, both on the original and the bootleg version. Toy Guy flat out couldn't get it to stay together on his. Although on the knockoff copy I've handled, I had no such issue. Most of my issues stemmed from how tight the leg sections were, but that's typical KOQC nonsense. versions, and is to be expected if you're used to buying unofficial versions. As for my copy, it was a smidge difficult at first, but over time it loosened up. These days it's pretty easy, but your mileage may vary on this one, regardless of which version you get. And moving to the very back, I love how they've molded in exhaust ports here. They're not painted, but it's pretty cool that they're here to begin with. It's a detail they could have gone without. The legacy version certainly didn't bother. But hey, it's here and it's neat. Taking a step back, this figure is pretty neat overall. There are flaws with it to be sure, such as the ones I've mentioned already. Also, the wheels don't tab in, they just rely on friction to stay in place. It's a real shame these aren't given extra stability. He rolls great otherwise, but aside from that, it's a solid little race car. I mean, I could complain about the struts on the front that allow the shoulders to transform properly, but come on, look at the size of it, man. What are you gonna do? That said, I ultimately think I prefer the design on the legacy one, even with the open head seats. I've always been a sucker for mechanical detail, and post-war for Cybertron figures have always delivered that in spades. But hey, it's still a great alt mode, not much I can complain about. And Dead End carries that pedigree too, once again coming in with a vehicle mode that's damn close to the original. Like, you take a look at photographs of the real thing, and yep, that's definitely a Porsche.
No, Dad! Oh, you gotta be kidding me.
Getting a Porsche.
The paint and mechanical detail are definitely a lot more minimalist. In fact, he probably has the least amount of detail from the whole lineup. Doesn't matter though, this alt mode still brings the pain. Love how they painted everything at both the front and the back. It's only 2 shades, but honestly, that's all you need. No lights are missed at any of the angles, and I love it. The subtle slope towards the front hits just right. Not too flat and not too curved. Same with the back windows, it's got that perfect roundness. And hey, the exhaust pipes return. Once again, something that was wholly unnecessary, but very much appreciated. And on top of that, this alt mode even has accessories. Controversial accessories. These two are spoiler pieces, and they plug in nicely and solidly into the back here. This adds some much needed breakup for the latter half, and although it sadly takes attention away from the wonderfully painted taillight section, I think it makes the alt mode better overall. There's just one problem. He can't transform with these on. They store in the same place they'd normally be in robot mode, but there just isn't enough clearance to keep these on without stressing the plastic. And to be honest, I'd rather not do that. As such, people have taken to call out this blatant use of parts forming, and I get it. The original toy and toon both had the spoiler. Here's the thing though, the original car both did and didn't, depending on which model you got. There's nothing stopping you from just leaving these off to the side and not using them at all. Sure, I would have much preferred the way Breakdown did it with his segmented molding trick, but I'm not sure that would have worked with the way the legs transform anyway, which to be honest I think is an okay trade-off. Plus it's hardly as heinous as something along the lines of Review 114, so personally I feel this is an unfortunate caveat, but not something that pisses me off too much. Not like the paint chipping. The windows by far are the worst paint chippage on the entire set. At least Wild Riders is close to the ground and can be easily ignored, or I suppose it's a little bit easier to ignore. This is in plain view. It's even worse when you realize the bootleg doesn't have this issue. And no, it's not just the copy I handled. I confirmed with Toy Guy that his copy had no chipping either. It's only a thing on the official version. That said, don't let that be the main reason for going for the bootleg, because there are other issues that we'll get to. It's a real shame because otherwise this is a damn nice Legends alt mode. This floor takes a top tier Porsche and turns it into just a cromulent one. Ah yes, the word cromulent. Always been bugged by that word's definition. It sounds like it should mean fantastic and of great importance, but no, it just means serviceable. That linguistic quirk always pissed me off. Tangents aside though, that's what this set is. Perfectly cromulent. Dead End is still pretty good even with the issues, and Dragstrip brings his A game from every angle. The variety just makes for a more fun experience. I'm sure when New Age eventually releases a Dragstrip, it'll easily be more accurate and Dead End won't be strapped with all those conundrums, but hey, these are pretty damn good. Anyway, size-wise, these feel weirdly smaller than the first two. They're not. Dead End is roughly the same size and Dragstrip has the same mass, only flattened. But it definitely feels that way. Ah well, such an oddity is hardly cause for concern. As for the knockoff versions, they're about what you'd expect at this point. They don't scale with anything, so don't even bother. That aside, no real issues here. Those will turn up mainly in the robot mode. Speaking of, I think it's time we wrapped this up. Let's convert these motherfuckers. Right after a quick word from our sponsor. Yeah, baby! Robotoyz is back! Finally got a chance to talk about a figure they provided me with. After seeing the brilliance of the first set, I pre-ordered these the night after, and they were pretty quick with the delivery. Robotoyz is one of Australia's most trusted Transformers retailers, specializing in a wide variety of products across multiple companies. Of course, these fellows have been off the market for some time, as tends to be the case with my style of reviewing, but there are plenty of Magic Square figures you can still grab. Although personally, I'd recommend going with New Age or Iron Factory myself. Whatever you get though, if you haven't already, don't forget to plug in that sweet code DrLock 10% off for a pretty self-explanatory one-time discount. Anywho, now that that's out of the way, it's converting time. Hit me! So all things considered, the first set of the Magic Square Menasor lineup was pretty pedestrian. I mean, Breakdown was basically just a copy of Sideswipe, it was basically just a copy of Masterpiece Sideswipe, just with a different front chest there, and Wild Rider was basically just a copy of Breakdown, so not much to discuss there. These two are a bit more interesting. They each have their own individual transformations, wholly separate from each other. No reused engineering between the two. Dragstrip is the simpler of the two, but he still has some neat little tricks up his sleeve. Now, the first thing you want to do is bring the wheels out part of the way. They're just going to stay there for a little bit, because they'll transform the rest later once the rest of the legs are done. You take these two sections here and rotate them around to the front like so. Jostle it a little bit so that you can get the legs out and fold in this middle panel here, and then yoink the legs out like so. I am not a fan of this sliding rail technique they've used. I've never been a fan of sliding rails, and there's actually a precedent for these kinds of legs failing over time, as we've seen with hybrid style Black Convoy, so I don't really like the use of these. But only time will tell. Anywho, you want to rotate these sections around like so to make the ankle supports like that. Or I should say heel supports, really. The wheels then rotate the rest of the way inwards like so, using the double hinges. And they form really nice feet that look incredibly clean, and are very sturdy too. Anywho, what you want to do is just take these arms and pull them out on these other sliding rails. These ones are a bit more understandable because they're pretty sturdy and they've got other ways of locking in. This part opens up and folds over the top, also revealing the head, and you can also rotate that around 180 degrees. Wheels rotate back, and I actually think this form of the wheel transformation is a little bit better than the Legacy version. Although on the whole, I prefer the Legacy transformation, it's just more fun. Yoink out the arms like the previous versions, but something the previous versions didn't do was rotate them around and also rotate around the fists. This allows you to change the detail from the angled car details to the flat toon details. And it works really well. It's just an all-around fun transformation. With the exception of the sliding rails, which are pretty solid for now, but you know how that might turn out later, everything functions fine. It's great. Now, Dead End is a lot more controversial. People hate this transformation. They say it's overcomplicated and has no place in the Legend scale. Well, we've dealt with Magic Square overcomplicated transformations on the channel before, and let me tell you, that just ain't it. This is actually really clever and really fun. Sure, it's not accurate, but I really like what they've done here. First thing you want to do is bring this section down like that and lock it into place there. Then what you want to do is bring these sections down halfway, or more than halfway, just not all the way, that's the main point. Jostle the back section loose a little bit. These sections will then open up and give enough clearance to the back. The back pieces then use the double hinge to go back, and then you can sort of separate and start transforming them with this wheel part going all the way, that clicking into there, and then the top section and the foot just rotating around and clipping into place, just like with Sideswipe and Wild Rider. At first, it seems really weird and confusing, but once you get the hang of it, it's really clever and really fun. Like, look at that. Look at how satisfying that is. Look at how the legs rearrange themselves. That is top tier engineering, and I do not get why anyone hates that, but to each their own, I suppose. Anywho, the rest is fairly simple in comparison. This just has a double hinge that goes back like that. The arms then use their double hinges to rotate around like so. I'm not the biggest fan of these, but they work fine enough. And then the newly revealed tabs plug into there, like that. Head rotates around, and arms yoink out like so, like every other robot or every other car in the set, and the wrists rotate around 180 degrees. And the reason the wrists rotate and don't just stay in place is so that the back parts have enough clearance there. If they're left as is, they just don't work. The whole thing doesn't hold together. The car bulges out and it doesn't look very good and puts stress on the plastic. But other than that, damn, that is a fine transformation. Really clever. Again, not accurate when it comes to the legs, but very much worth it and very much appreciated. So yeah, Magic Square needed to up their game and give us new and unique and interesting transformations, and well, they just did that. Less so with Dragstrip, but they did it enough, and very much so with Dead End. They still aren't my favorite transformations of the group, and you'll come to see which one is in the future, but they do what Magic Square set out to do, and they show that Magic Square can do fun and creative transformations, instead of something that looks like the dog's breakfast. I keep saying, the other transformations don't have to be bad. We have proof right here that they don't, but Magic Square just off with that. Life is cruel sometimes, ain't it? Now, for the most part, this set has leaned pretty hard into the toon stylings. In most cases, the robot modes are spitting images of the Sunbow model with subtle additions of extra detail. For better or for... Actually, no, I think this is just straight up better. Because the only example that would be worse is Dragstrip. The Sunbow model for this is, to put it bluntly, not good. And coincidentally, this is the one time the set deviates. It's sort of the toon details plonked onto the proportions of the toy. And given the original was actually pretty well proportioned as far as Scramble City limbs go, this is a wonderful mashup. This is one lean leaning into the lanky aesthetic to emphasize his slickness. Way better than old Dumpy Meister over here. Sometimes Sunbow designs are pretty cool, other times they're this. The head sculpt is sharp as shit, easily taking the crown for the best head sculpt in the set. It's a bit more neon and metallic than the screen model, but it's incredibly well sculpted and proportioned. Love the metallic purple they've used too. Oddly enough, it's not used anywhere else in the set, not even in the combined mode. Don't know where they could have put it, but it's a missed opportunity if you ask me. One thing I also adore is the cut of the back of the head. Because they don't have to fold up like the previous two, they've been able to drill in an opening at the back, allowing the head to look up if you so desire. Not part of the transformation, mind you, purely for articulation. That's pretty awesome. The chest is pretty neat too, taking the toon mechanical detail and plastering it all over the toy proportions. Interestingly, this is the exact opposite approach of what the Legacy version does, which is yoink the toy style engine and place it inside the toon style's proportions. In fact, that's the main engineering philosophical difference between these two. And to be honest, as cool as the Magic Square one is, I think Hasbro wins out in the end. Not just with the proportions either, there's a subtle simplicity and maturity in the transformation that just tickles my neurons, even overriding my complaints about the lack of paint. Also, side note, the reason the other cars aren't getting comparisons is because I don't own them. Might seem inconsequential now, but someone is going to ask when watching this in the future. They just aren't out at the time of recording. But taking it back to the design of the chest we're supposed to be reviewing, interestingly, the torso is actually quite wide. It's only the prominent cockpit section that creates the illusion of slenderness, and it works really well. Doesn't come across as much on camera due to lighting differences, but in person he feels a lot slimmer than he actually is. Also doesn't work as well on the larger version, just as a heads up. Although the camera makes it seem like the opposite. Still hate the shade of brown they used on the KO. Just... why? The arms are pretty stock standard, with not much to discuss. I really like the way the wheels work, but other than that, there's not much to talk about here. The legs are kinda cool too, although I feel they could go a little harder than they currently do. Due to how he pegs into the combined mode, the knee pads have become a lot less pronounced from the Sunbow model. I get it, but it's still disappointing. He's also lacking quite a bit of detail below the knees. After seeing the subtle mechanical detail added on the previous two, and eventually seeing how amazing Dead Ends turned out, this seems pretty underdone. Oh well, at least you get the side blocks, which works as a nice reuse of vehicle kibble. Oddly enough, these come off, I suppose to give him a cleaner look. Looks wrong to me though, so I don't bother. Also, the KO comes with spares in case you lose them, when they could have just glued it on instead. Still better than the old hand fall off nonsense previous Magic Square releases had though. Actually, I say that, but later on as I was writing this, I realized his hands do fall off. He's the only one out of the set who does this, aside from Motormaster's head. Really wish Magic Square would stop doing this, but well. One thing I will give them credit for though is the use of the spoiler as the feet. This is the one toy style detail that's been carried over, and I'm all here for it. It's also really sturdy because it doesn't actually chill on the wheels. The wheels secretly hover slightly above the ground, letting the engine parts hold the ankle supports. I'm sure they could have figured out a wheel locking mechanism, but seeing the issues ankle wheels potentially cause, I'm glad they went this route instead. Also, I find it funny that this is the one toy detail that carried over from this, whilst on the Legacy version, it's the one toy detail that didn't carry over, at least until repro labels made adjustments. Just a humorous thing to note. Ultimately though, he's a solid figure. Looks-wise, he's probably the weakest of the set with minimal detail in comparison and not a lot of paint on show, but considering the alternative and the amount of stylistic adjustments made, it could have been a lot worse. From most angles, he's perfectly serviceable, or I suppose, cromulent. Aside from the leg detail and the weird fally-offy bitties, there's not much to complain about. Sure, I could have asked for the backpack to be a bit higher, but given the size, I think that's a bit much to ask for. Even his weapon is pretty neat, with some awesome angles and cool flamethrower stylings. And yes, this time I actually have the weapons. Guess I don't have to rely on the bootleg for comparison shots here. Articulation works pretty well. Sadly, you lose the ab crunch because of the combiner joint stuck in there, and the forward toe motion thanks to the way the legs transform now. Aside from that though, he's basically got everything the previous releases had, which is still still a lot for a Legends figure, although I guess a lot is becoming more standard nowadays. Now, due to the way the waist unpegs using the waist joint, hypothetically it could fall off during standard posing. Personally though, I've never run into this issue. I'm not saying it can't happen, but I've never seen it happen firsthand before, so I don't think it's really a thing. Actually, and I'm adding this in a bit later, about a week before this video released, I had to go back to my friend's house to film a couple of comparison shots with the KO that I forgot about. And when I was transforming it, KO Dead End would not stay together. Of course it's KO Dead End. It's always KO Dead End. So in the end, Dragstrip has a lot of cool shit up top, but starts to get boring the further down you go. He's still a solid member within the lineup, but at this point I'm not seeing the craziness that blew me away at first. Meanwhile, Dead End is sort of reversed when it comes to the layout of his detail, where the top half is much less interesting than the bottom. Now, credit where credit is due, they have once again gone in and made alterations to remove the dumpiness of the Sunbow model. It's a lot more subtle this time though, and I feel they could have leaned into that idea a bit more. The chest is very well painted, with two shades picking out spitting image details from the cartoon. I just wish it was a bit more indented. I get why they can't, similarly to Breakdown and Wild Rider this has to peg onto the trailer skeleton. As such, it can't jut out too much. And when you take into account how thin the panel is to begin with, you understand why the details are so shallow. Still, I just think it looks a little bland, or at least more bland than the other three. At least this has an excuse though, the head sculpt sure as hell doesn't. It's not bad per se, but it's not necessarily good either. It's weirdly puffed out and the visor just doesn't pop at all. They've already reused the brown from Dragstrip, so reusing the metallic purple seems like a no-brainer. But no, they didn't, and as a result, this is probably the weakest head sculpt of the set. The arms are okay, I guess. You get some of the mechanical detail references from the toon design with the extra grills on the forearms, but at this point, I'm kind of finding it hard to stay awake. Not even the gun can keep me awake at this point. It's just sort of your average G1 weapon with a silencer at the end. Whoop-de-doo, snore-de-snore. I'm falling asleep again. Not a bad robot design by any means, but I'm not being given any reason to care. Until you hit the legs. Holy shit, why do these go so hard? You can see a couple of references to the Sunbow model, with the wheels on the insides and the extra blocks on the front, but the rest is pulled straight from the designer's ass, and it's awesome. I keep seeing people trashing this, and I just don't get it. The way the bumpers slide into the knees is such a cool aesthetic, and they actually blend in amazingly. You'd expect them to float above the design and seem out of place, but nope. And on top of that, they brought back the back-swept kibble motif that made Breakdown so awesome, only applying it to the windows instead. Even with the chunks missing used to accommodate the wheel chassis, this still looks cohesive as f***. I honestly want to see this design used more frequently on Dead Ends. Hell, give it to a Generations rendition of Cyberverse Dead End if you have to. It's awesome and stands proud above the blandness of the toon model. I really wish the rest of this robot went this hard. It's sort of like the designer had one full awesome figure and the top half went to Dragstrip while the bottom half went to Dead End. I suppose that's better than a figure that's 100% boring, but still, it's a bit weird. As for articulation, he's basically Dragstrip with an added toe pivot. Unfortunately, this time the hands are actually mushroom pegged in, as opposed to whatever Dragstrip had. I'm getting real sick of this shit on Magic Square figures. And size-wise, they're both surprisingly thinner than the leg components. Dragstrip I get, given his overall aesthetic, but given how wide Dead End feels, even with the subtle angling implemented to counteract that, you'd think these would be the same width. But no, Dead End is surprisingly not a wide boy. And as for the bootleg versions, well, this may be the most important comparison of the set. There are many factors that influence getting a knockoff over the original. Perhaps the original is too hard to come by, or maybe the original is outside your price range. Maybe you prefer the scale of the bootleg, or maybe the colors are more appealing. The upscaled version of Magic Square Menasor might be purchased for any of these reasons, but any KO connoisseur will tell you that the decreased price comes with an extra tax of its own. KO companies always skimp over with their quality control. It's how they're able to use standard materials whilst still providing a cheaper price. The Dead End bootleg is essentially the make or break for whether you should settle for the KO or hunt down the original. His bootleg is by far the worst when it comes to quality control. On my friend's local copy, the knee pads just refuse to stay in, making posing a pain in the ass. And you think that's bad? Wait till you see Toy Guy's copy, where the whole thing is as floppy as my Democracy Manifest after seeing the invoice for the Mass Toys Seeker project. Now, if you can accept this and are willing to modify your toys to compensate or just ignore the wonky tolerances altogether, maybe you'll be happy with the KO. If you cannot, then the lower price just isn't worth it. Grab a second-hand copy or just wait for the New Age version. People always like to glamorize knockoffs as as the superior way to collect, but that simply isn't true. There are upsides, as stated earlier, but they all come with caveats, and that's also provided you buy from a reputable source. Most people recommending bootleg purchases like to entice potential fans with deals on AliExpress and Taobao. You tried getting a refund from those websites? I tried once for a Black Mamba Ares nitrogen that was lost in transit. Apparently the postal service throwing it out was my fault despite not having anything to do with it, and a refund wasn't valid. That's 50 bucks I'll never get back. And what if it shows up with missing pieces or not the thing you wanted at all? After reviewing Last Night Reveal the Shield Optimus Prime, I saw half the comments were telling me to get the Fireburst version. So I did, and not only was the listing fraudulent as the toy was an undisclosed KO, but it was missing parts. It took a week of the seller trying to gaslight me into getting a replacement instead of a refund just to get the cash back. And in the end, he was still $4 short. And that's eBay, mind you, not some shady bootleg site. Yes, the old saying is true, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. I'm not saying don't get the KO. Again, there are reasons to get it. If I didn't want people getting the KO, I wouldn't have shown comparisons at all. I'm just saying, be aware of the risks involved on both a tactile and a logistical level. But enough tangents, this review has had far too many of them, and it's time to wrap things up. Ultimately, the main difference between set 1 and set 2 is the risks taken. Breakdown and Wild Rider form a very safe set that has more consistent quality overall, while Dragstrip and Dead End try to bite off a lot more. Sometimes they can't chew at all, and as such the lows are much lower, but the highs are also far higher than what you've seen prior. When these figures succeed, they soar, and ultimately that's the type of figure I prefer. A nice simple solid figure is fine and all, but I'll always gravitate to releases that push the envelope, even if they don't always succeed. And you know what? Something like this was sorely needed at this point. Had they just come out with another solid but safe release after the first set, the hype would have died down. If you don't raise the bar, fandom interest begins to dwindle. You have to keep moving forward lest you be cast into the abyss. And even if these figures have more issues, they're still pretty great. That's why they retain the same score as Breakdown and Wild Rider. We've still yet to see a true 5-star release in this lineup, but it's important to remember, a combiner isn't just the sum of its parts. We're only halfway there, and there's still a lot to show in regards to why this is the best combiner in my collection. There are other stories for other times. But anyway, fandom public consciousness is a conversation, so drop your thoughts on... I guess the stylization in the comments? I don't know, I'm sort of stretching for this review. It's been real scatterbrained. Still, do you prefer massive deviations from the G1 Sunbow models at such a scale? Or perhaps the deviations have pushed you away from this lineup? Maybe you're still waiting for the New Age version to come out, so you can see the two aesthetics lined up. And as always, there's a context for everything. See y'all next week for part 3.